What if a single note from a little girl could unravel a dangerous secret, and one guard had seconds to act? You won't believe what happens next. Stick around to the end. Before we dive in, drop your location in the comments, hit like and subscribe for more jaw-dropping stories. Let's roll. The city hummed with life on a crisp autumn afternoon. Paul Gregg stood at his post outside the gleaming glass doors of Harper Towers, a towering office building in the heart of downtown. At 32, he was a security guard with a sharp eye and a steady hand, his black uniform crisp against the grey stone of the building's entrance. His job was simple: watch the flow of people, check IDs, and keep the peace. Most days passed without incident, just a steady stream of employees and visitors moving through the lobby. Today, though, something felt different. Paul adjusted his cap as the clock above the entrance ticked toward 4 p.m. The streets buzzed with early commuters, their footsteps quick against the pavement. He scanned the crowd, noting the usual mix of briefcases and coffee cups. A young girl caught his attention. She couldn't have been more than 6, her dark hair tied back with a bright yellow ribbon. She walked beside a tall woman in a sharp grey coat, her small hand clasped tightly in the woman's grip. The pair moved with purpose, heading straight for Harper Towers. As they approached, the girl's eyes met Paul's. She had a quiet intensity about her, unusual for someone so young. The woman, likely her mother, barely glanced at Paul, her focus fixed ahead as she pulled the girl closer to the doors. Paul stepped forward, ready to ask for their identification, when the girl did something unexpected. She slipped her hand free from the woman's grasp, reached into her jacket pocket, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. Before the woman could react, the girl darted toward Paul and pressed the note into his hand. "Read it," she whispered, her voice soft but urgent. Her wide eyes held his for a split second, before the woman called out, "Lila, come here now!" The woman's tone was sharp, her face tightening as she grabbed the girl's arm and tugged her back. Lila stumbled slightly, but didn't resist, letting herself be pulled into the building. The glass doors swung shut behind them, leaving Paul standing there, the note still warm in his palm. He glanced down at the crumpled paper, his curiosity piqued. Most kids didn't slip notes to strangers, especially not with that kind of determination. He unfolded it carefully, expecting a doodle or a childish scribble. Instead, he found a single sentence written in shaky, uneven letters. "Help her, she's in trouble." Below the words was a small, smudged drawing of a crying face, the ink blurred as if drawn in haste. Paul's stomach tightened. He looked up at the doors, then back at the note. The building swallowed hundreds of people every day. Executives, cleaners, delivery workers. Who was her? The woman with Lila, someone else inside. His training kicked in, urging him to stay calm and assess the situation. But the girl's expression lingered in his mind, a silent plea he couldn't ignore. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, his pulse quickening. Whatever this was, he had to act fast. Inside Harper Towers, the lobby buzzed with activity. Elevators dinged, phones rang, and footsteps echoed off the marble floors. Paul stepped through the doors, his eyes scanning the space. The woman and Lila were already halfway across the room, heading toward the elevators. The woman's pace was brisk, her grip on Lila's hand firm. Paul hesitated, then made a decision. He crossed the lobby in long strides, his boots clicking against the floor, and reached the elevator just as the doors began to close. "Hold it, please," he called, slipping inside. The woman shot him a quick, irritated look, but said nothing. Lila stood beside her, staring at the floor. The elevator hummed as it climbed, the numbers lighting up one by one. Paul kept his expression neutral, his hand resting casually near his radio. He needed more information, and he needed it now. The elevator climbed steadily, its soft hum filling the silence. Paul stood near the back, his eyes flicking between Lila and the woman beside her. The woman's grey coat hung stiffly on her frame, her knuckles white from gripping Lila's hand. Lila kept her gaze down, her small fingers twitching slightly. The note burned in Paul's pocket, its words looping in his mind. "Help her, she's in trouble." He needed answers, but the confined space offered no room for questions. The elevator dinged at the 15th floor, and the doors slid open. The woman stepped out, pulling Lila along. Paul followed, keeping his distance. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with sleek office doors and frosted glass panels. Muted voices drifted from behind them, a low buzz of workday chatter. The woman moved quickly, her heels tapping a sharp rhythm against the polished floor. Lila stumbled once, her short legs struggling to keep up, but the woman didn't slow. Paul adjusted his pace, staying just far enough behind to avoid suspicion. His radio crackled faintly at his hip, a reminder of his duty. But this felt bigger than routine protocol. At the end of the hall, the woman stopped at a door marked Executive Suite M. Randall. She swiped a keycard, and the lock clicked open. Paul caught a glimpse of a spacious office beyond. Dark wood furniture, a wide window overlooking the city, and a man standing near a desk. The man was tall, his suit sharp and expensive, his hair slicked back. He turned as the door opened, his face unreadable. The woman pushed Lila inside, and the door swung shut behind them. Paul lingered in the hallway, his mind racing. He couldn't barge in without cause, but he couldn't walk away either. He stepped closer to the door, pressing his ear against the cool surface. Voices filtered through, muffled but distinct. The man spoke first, his tone low and clipped. "You're late, Elena. I told you to be here by 3. The woman, Elena, replied, her voice tight. "Traffic held us up. It's done now, so let's finish this." A pause followed, then the man again. "And the girl?" Elena's answer was quieter, almost hesitant. "She's here. That's what you wanted." Paul frowned. The conversation sounded transactional, not familial. He glanced at the note again, unfolding it silently in the hallway. The crying face stared back at him, its smudged lines a silent alarm. His gut told him Lila wasn't just a kid caught in a spat. She was the key to something deeper. He straightened, scanning the hall. A security camera blinked above him, its red light steady. He'd have to move carefully. The door opened suddenly and Paul stepped back, pretending to adjust his radio. Eleanor emerged alone, her face pale and drawn. She didn't look at him, her eyes fixed on the floor as she hurried toward the elevator. Paul waited until she was out of sight, then approached the office door. It hadn't fully latched, leaving a sliver of space. He nudged it open with his boot and slipped inside. The office was larger than he'd expected, the air thick with the scent of leather and coffee. The man, Randall, judging by the door, stood near the window, his back to Paul. Lila sat on a cushioned chair, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up as Paul entered, her eyes widening with recognition. Randall turned, his brow furrowing. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Security," Paul said, keeping his tone even. "Routine check. Someone reported a disturbance on this floor." It was a lie, but it bought him time. Randall's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. "No disturbance here, just a meeting. You can go." Paul nodded, his eyes flicking to Lila. She shifted in her seat, her small hand darting to her pocket. Before Randall could notice, she pulled out another note and slid it across the chair's armrest toward Paul. He moved quickly, stepping closer under the pretense of inspecting the room. "Nice view," he said, casually brushing his hand over the note and pocketing it. Randall watched him, his expression cold. "It is. Now, if you're done, I have work to do." Paul nodded again and backed toward the door, his heart pounding. He stepped into the hall, the door clicking shut behind him. Once alone, he unfolded the second note. This one was shorter, scrawled in the same shaky hand. "He's lying. Save her now." Paul's breath caught. The pieces didn't fit yet, but the urgency in Lila's words pushed him forward. He headed for the stairwell, avoiding the elevator's cameras. The building had 20 floors, countless offices, and a basement level. If someone was in trouble, they could be anywhere. He needed help, but he couldn't trust just anyone, not until he knew more. At the stairwell landing, he pulled out his radio and switched to a private channel. "This is Greg, 15th floor. I need backup at Harper Towers, possible situation in the executive suite. Bring someone from management too." Static crackled, then a voice replied, "Copy that, on our way." Paul pocketed the radio and started down the stairs, his boots echoing in the narrow space. He had no proof, no clear target, but Lila's notes were a lifeline he couldn't ignore. Paul descended the stairwell, his boots pounding against the metal steps. The echo bounced off the concrete walls, mixing with the faint crackle of his radio. Lila's second note weighed heavy in his pocket, He's lying. Save her now. The words fueled his urgency, each syllable a push to move faster. He'd called for backup, but waiting wasn't an option. The 15th floor felt miles away now, and Harper Towers loomed larger with every unanswered question. Who was Randall hiding? What was the package he'd mentioned on the phone? The stairwell door clanged open at the ground floor. Paul stepped into the lobby, the marble expanse buzzing with late afternoon traffic. Employees streamed toward the exits, their voices a dull roar. He scanned the crowd, searching for Elena. She'd left the office alone, her face pale and tense. If anyone knew what Randall was planning, it might be her. His eyes landed on a grey coat near the revolving doors. She was slipping outside, her pace quick but unsteady. Paul wove through the throng, dodging briefcases and outstretched arms. The note from Lila burned in his mind, a quiet command he couldn't shake. He reached the doors just as Eleanor stepped onto the sidewalk, her head low. The city air hit him, sharp with exhaust and the promise of evening chill. He kept her in sight, matching her stride from a distance. She turned down a side street, away from the main flow, her shoulders hunched. Paul followed, his hand brushing the radio at his hip. He needed to talk to her, but not here. Not yet. Elena stopped at a sleek silver car parked along the curb. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking. Paul closed the gap, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I need a word." She froze, her keys slipping to the pavement with a soft clink. Her eyes darted up, wide and startled. "I don't know you," she said, her voice thin. "Leave me alone." "I'm security from Harper Towers," Paul replied, stepping closer. "Your daughter gave me a note. Said someone's in trouble." Elena's face tightened, her lips pressing into a hard line. She bent to grab her keys, but Paul knelt first, picking them up and holding them out. "Lila's scared. What's going on up there?" Eleanor hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't help." She snatched the keys and turned to the car, but Paul blocked her path, his stance steady. "I can if you tell me who needs saving," he said. "Layla thinks I can." "That's why she wrote this." He pulled the first note from his pocket, holding it up. The crying face stared back, its smudged lines stark against the white paper. Her breath hitched. She stared at the note, then at Paul, her resolve cracking. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic. "Randall, he's holding someone in the basement. I didn't want this." Paul's pulse quickened. The basement, a concrete maze of storage rooms and maintenance tunnels, perfect for hiding something, or someone. "Who?" he pressed. "Who's down there?" Eleanor shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't say. He'll know it was me." She glanced back toward Harper Towers, her fear plain. "He's got people watching. Please, just let me go." Paul softened his tone, but kept his ground. "I won't let him hurt you or Lila. But I need a name. Give me that, and I'll handle the rest." She swallowed hard, then whispered, "Clara. Her name's Clara." Before Paul could ask more, Eleanor pushed past him, unlocked the car, and slid inside. The engine roared to life, and she peeled away, leaving him standing on the empty street. Clara. A name was a start. He turned back toward the building, his mind sharp with purpose. The basement was his target now. Inside Harper Towers, the lobby had thinned out, the clock ticking past 5 p.m. Paul bypassed the elevators, heading for a service door near the back. It led to a narrow staircase, the air growing cooler as he descended. His radio crackled again. Backup was close, but he couldn't wait. The stairs ended at a heavy metal door, its paint chipped and faded. He pushed it open, stepping into the basement's dim glow. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting uneven patches across the concrete floor. The space stretched wide, a labyrinth of crates, pipes, and locked storage units. Paul moved quietly, his senses sharp. A faint sound caught his ear. A muffled thump. Then silence. He followed it, turning past a row of boxes. The noise came again, louder, from a door at the far end. It was reinforced steel, a padlock gleaming on its latch. He pressed his ear to the surface, hearing a soft, rhythmic tapping from within. Someone was alive in there. Paul pulled a small tool from his belt, a lockpick he'd kept from his day's training with the Force. He worked the padlock, his fingers steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. The lock clicked open, and he eased the door ajar. A woman sat inside, her wrists bound with rope, her face bruised but defiant. She looked up, her green eyes meeting his. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice raw. "Paul Gregg, security," he said, kneeling to untie her. "Are you Clara?" She nodded, wincing as the ropes loosened. "How do you know?" she asked. "Long story," Paul replied, helping her stand. "Can you walk?" She tested her legs, leaning on him for support. "Yeah. Get me out of here before they come back." Footsteps echoed behind them, sharp and deliberate. Paul turned, pulling Clara behind a stack of crates. Two figures emerged from the shadows, Randall and a broad-shouldered man in a dark jacket. The second man carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. "She's gone," the man said, his voice gruff. Randall cursed under his breath. "Find her, now." Paul tightened his grip on Clara's arm, his mind racing. Backup was still minutes away and the basement offered few exits. He scanned the room, spotting a service hatch near the ceiling. It led to the loading dock. He'd seen it on building plans. "Stay low," he whispered to Clara, guiding her toward it. The footsteps grew closer, the flashlight's beam sweeping dangerously near. Time was running out. Paul crouched behind the crates, his breath steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. Clara leaned against him, her green eyes scanning the basement's dim corners. The service hatch loomed above, a narrow escape route to the loading dock. Randall and the broad-shouldered man moved closer, their footsteps sharp against the concrete. The flashlight beam sliced through the air, missing Paul and Clara by inches. "She can't have gone far," Randall said, his voice tight with frustration. "Check the back rooms." The second man grunted and turned, his heavy boots thudding toward the far end of the basement. Paul seized the moment. He pointed to the hatch and whispered, "That's our way out. Can you climb?" Clara nodded, her jaw tight despite the strain in her movements. She'd been tied up for who knows how long, but her determination held firm. Paul boosted her up, his hands firm under her feet. She grabbed the hatch's edge and pulled herself through, disappearing into the shadows above. Paul followed, hauling himself up with a quick, practiced motion. The hatch led to a tight crawl space, its metal walls cold against his palms. Ahead, Clara moved silently, her breaths shallow but even. The space opened into the loading dock, a wide platform stacked with boxes and lit by harsh yellow lights. A delivery truck idled near the bay doors, its engine rumbling low. Paul helped Clara down, keeping her steady as they ducked behind a pile of pallets. The city skyline glittered beyond the open doors, a stark reminder of the world outside Harper Towers. "We're not safe yet," Paul said, his voice low. "They'll figure out we're gone soon." Clara wiped sweat from her brow, her bruised face catching the light. "Randall's not just some suit," she said. "He's running something big. I overheard him. Shipments, payments, locked rooms. I was digging into it for my job." Paul frowned, piecing it together. "You're not family to him or Elena?" Clara shook her head. "No, I'm a reporter. Got too close to his operation." The revelation hit Paul like a jolt. Leela's notes weren't about a family feud. They were about exposing a crime. He pulled the second note from his pocket, rereading it. "He's lying. Save her now." Leela must have seen Clara, must have known she was in danger, but how? Questions piled up, but the roar of the truck's engine snapped him back. The driver climbed out, a wiry man in a cap, and headed inside, leaving the keys dangling in the ignition. Paul glanced at Clara. "Can you drive?" She managed a weak smile. "Better than I can run right now." They moved fast, slipping into the truck's cab. Clara took the wheel, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the key. The engine growled louder, and Paul slid into the passenger seat, his eyes on the rearview mirror. The bay doors stood open, but voices echoed from the basement. Randall and his man were closing in. Clara floored it, the truck lurching forward onto the street. Tires screeched as she swerved past a loading ramp, the city rushing by in a blur of lights and horns. Paul gripped the door, his radio buzzing with static. "Greg, This is backup, a voice cut through. We're at the lobby, where are you? He grabbed the radio, his words quick. Loading dock, heading east in a truck. I've got a civilian, Clara, she's a witness. Suspects Randall, 15th floor. He's armed and dangerous. The line crackled. Copy, we're rerouting, stay on the move. Clara shot him a look, her knuckles white on the wheel. Witness, huh? That's one way to put it. Poole nodded, his mind racing. You've got a story. I've got a job. Let's keep you alive to tell it. She steered through traffic, weaving past cars as the truck rumbled under them. The city streets stretched wide, but Poole knew Randall wouldn't let this go quietly. The truck roared through the city streets, its engine straining under Clara's steady grip. Poole braced himself in the passenger seat, his eyes locked on the side mirror. The black SUV trailed them, its headlights cutting through the dusk like a hunter's stare. Boxes still littered the road behind, a makeshift barrier from Poole's earlier move with the crowbar. But the SUV wove through the mess. The radio crackled in his hand, the voice of backup breaking through. Greg, we're 1 block east. What's your position? Poole pressed the button, his voice firm. Heading south on 7th, black SUV in pursuit. We've got a civilian on board. Clara shot him a glance, her bruised face tense but focused. They're not giving up, she said, swerving to avoid a slow-moving van. The truck tilted, its tires squealing, and Poole gripped the handle above the door. Neither are we, he replied. Keep going. They're almost here. The city blurred past. Storefronts, streetlights, pedestrians scattering as the chase tore through. The SUV surged closer, its bumper gleaming in the mirror. Poole spotted a figure leaning out the passenger window, something metallic in their hand. Get down, he shouted, pulling Clara's shoulder. A sharp crack split the air, and the truck's side mirror exploded into shards. Clara ducked, her hands steady on the wheel despite the jolt. They're shooting now, she yelled, her voice rising over the engine's growl. Poole nodded, his jaw tight. Randall's desperate. Whatever you found, it's big. He climbed back into the cargo area, scanning for anything useful. A stack of metal pipes rattled against the wall. He grabbed one, its weight solid in his hands. The SUV closed in, its driver pushing hard. Poole leaned out the broken rear door, the wind whipping past. He aimed the pipe like a javelin and hurled it toward the SUV's windshield. It struck with a loud thud, cracking the glass and forcing the driver to swerve. The vehicle fishtailed, losing speed, but didn't stop. Poole cursed under his breath and ducked back inside as another shot rang out, pinging off the truck's frame. Clara turned onto a wider street, the skyline opening up ahead. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance. Backup was closing in. There, Poole said, pointing. 2 police cars sped toward them, sirens wailing. The SUV hesitated, its driver slowing as the gap narrowed. Clara didn't let up, pushing the truck toward the approaching units. The police cars split, one blocking the road ahead, the other peeling off to flank the SUV. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, shouting commands over the chaos. The SUV skidded to a stop, its doors flying open. 2 men emerged, hands raised, but Poole's focus shifted back to Harper Towers. We need to get Lila, he said, climbing back to the cab as Clara eased the truck to a halt. She nodded, catching her breath. And Eleanor. She's in this too. Poole radioed in, his words quick. Suspects detained on 7th. I'm heading back to Harper Towers. Possible minor in danger, 15th floor. An officer approached the truck, his badge glinting under the streetlights. Greg, you okay? He asked, peering inside. Poole nodded. Yeah, this is Clara, reporter. She's got info on Randall exec suite. I need a unit to follow me back. The officer waved over a partner, and within moments a patrol car was ready to roll. Clara slid out of the driver's seat, her legs shaky, but her resolve intact. I'm coming too, she said. I started this mess. I'll see it through. The drive back was tense but swift, the patrol car's lights painting the streets in urgent hues. Harper Towers loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the city's glow. Poole led the way inside, Clara and 2 officers trailing him. The lobby was quieter now, the evening shift thinning out. He bypassed the elevators again, heading for the stairwell. Faster this way, he said, taking the steps 2 at a time. The 15th floor waited above, and every second counted. They reached the executive suite, the door still ajar from earlier. Poole pushed it open, his hand on his baton. The office was empty. No Randall, no Lila, no Alina. Papers lay scattered across the desk, a phone off its hook. Clara stepped in, her eyes scanning the mess. "They cleared out fast," she said, picking up a torn invoice. "Look, shipping dates, coded names. This ties to what I found." Paul joined her, spotting a small drawing pinned under a stapler. It was Lila's. A rough sketch of a truck with a red X on it. "She knew we'd get out," Paul said, his voice low. "She's leaving clues." Footsteps echoed in the hall, and he turned, baton ready. An officer appeared, breathless. "Basement secure, but we found something. Hidden room, locked tight. Looks like a holding cell." Paul exchanged a look with Clara. "That's where they kept you?" She nodded. "And maybe more. We need to check it." They descended again, the stairwells chill, biting deeper this time. The basement felt different now. Officers milled about, radios buzzing with updates. The hidden room sat behind a false panel, its door pried open by the team. Inside, shelves lined the walls, stacked with unmarked boxes. A folding chair sat in the center, ropes coiled beside it. Clara pointed to a corner. "There. Files. That's what I was after." She grabbed a folder, flipping it open. Pages detailed shipments, payments, and a name. Project Eclipse. Paul scanned the documents, his pulse quickening. "This isn't just money, it's equipment, tech, maybe weapons." Clara nodded, her voice grim. "Randall's selling to private buyers. I got too close, so he grabbed me." A shout interrupted them. An officer waved from the hall. "Found a tunnel, leads outside, fresh tracks." Paul bolted toward it, Clara close behind. The tunnel stretched narrow and damp, its end spilling into an alley. Outside, tire marks scarred the pavement leading north. Paul pulled out Lila's first note again, the crying face a silent call. "They've got her," he said, his voice hard. "Randall's running, and he took Lila with him." Clara gripped the folder tight. "Then we find them. This ends tonight." Paul stood in the alley, the tire marks stretching north under the faint glow of a flickering street lamp. The tunnel's damp air clung to his uniform, but his focus was razor-sharp. Clara gripped the folder from the hidden room, its pages detailing Project Eclipse, a shadowy operation tied to Randall's smuggling. Lila was out there, taken by a man desperate to cover his tracks. Paul clenched the first note in his pocket, the crying face a quiet plea echoing in his mind. "We're close," he said, his voice steady. "Those tracks are fresh." Clara nodded, her bruised face set with resolve. "He's got a head start, but he's not thinking straight. Panic makes mistakes." She flipped through the folder, her fingers pausing on a map scribbled with coordinates. "Here, storage facility 10 miles out. Matches the shipping logs." Paul glanced at the map, then at the officers securing the alley. "That's our lead," he said, waving one over. "Need a car and a team. Suspects fleeing north with a miner. Storage site's the target." The officer radioed it in, and within minutes a patrol car rolled up, its engine idling low. Paul slid into the passenger seat, Clara beside him, while 2 officers took the back. The driver, a young woman with a tight ponytail, floored it, the car lurching onto the main road. City lights faded as they sped past warehouses and empty lots, the skyline shrinking in the rear view. Paul kept his eyes ahead, tracing the tire marks in his mind. Lila's courage, slipping him those notes, drove him forward. The storage facility emerged from the darkness, a sprawl of low buildings ringed by chain-link fencing. The gate hung open, its lock smashed. Tire tracks curved toward a warehouse at the far end, where a single light burned above a loading bay. "That's it," Clara said, pointing. The driver slowed, cutting the headlights as they approached. Paul spotted a familiar black SUV parked near the entrance, its engine still warm. "Randall's here," he said, unclipping his baton. "Let's move." They piled out, the officers drawing their sidearms. The night air carried the faint hum of machinery from inside. Paul led the group, sticking to the shadows along the fence. He reached the warehouse door, a heavy steel slab, slightly ajar, and eased it open. The interior stretched wide, stacked with crates and humming generators. A narrow walkway ran overhead, leading to an office with lit windows. Voices drifted down, sharp and urgent. Paul motioned for the team to split. "Check the floor," he whispered to the officers. "Clara, with me." They climbed a metal staircase, its steps creaking under their weight. At the top, the office door stood cracked open. Paul peered through, his breath catching. Randall paced inside, his suit rumpled, a phone pressed to his ear. "Move the shipment now," he snapped. "I don't care about the cost." Lila sat on a folding chair, her hands clasped tight, her eyes scanning the room. Elena stood nearby, her face pale, clutching a bag. Clara leaned close, her voice a whisper. "She's alive. We've got him." Paul nodded, his hand on the door. He pushed it open, stepping inside with Clara behind him. "Randall, it's over," he said, his tone firm. "Let the girl go." Randall spun around, his phone clattering to the floor. His eyes widened, then narrowed. "You," he hissed, "should have stayed out of this." He lunged for a desk drawer, pulling out a small handgun. Paul moved fast, swinging his baton. It struck Randall's wrist, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Randall stumbled back, clutching his arm. Eleanor shrieked, dropping her bag, while Lila bolted from the chair, running toward Paul. He caught her, pulling her behind him. "Stay with Clara," he said, handing her off. Clara knelt, shielding Lila with her body as the girl clung to her. Randall recovered, his voice rising. "You've got no idea what you're ruining." He charged at Paul, fists swinging. Paul sidestepped, grabbing Randall's arm and twisting it behind his back. The man grunted, his strength fading as Paul pinned him to the desk. "I know enough," Paul said, his grip iron tight. "Smuggling tech, kidnapping, shooting at us. You're done." Footsteps pounded below. The officers had cleared the warehouse floor and were climbing the stairs. They burst in, weapons raised. "Hands up!" one shouted. Randall slumped, his fight gone as an officer cuffed him. Elena sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want this," she sobbed. "He forced me." Paul ignored her for now, turning to Lila. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softening. Lila nodded, her dark hair falling loose from its ribbon. "I knew you'd come," she said, her small voice steady. She pulled a final note from her pocket and handed it to him. Paul unfolded it. "Thank you." A simple drawing of a star sat beside the words, its lines bold and clear. He smiled, tucking it away. "You're the brave one," he said. The officers hauled Randall out, his curses echoing down the walkway. Another secured Elena, guiding her to her feet. Clara stood, the folder still in hand, her eyes on the crates below. "This is bigger than him," she said. "These files, dates, buyers, locations, it's a network." Paul nodded, his mind shifting to the next step. "Police will handle it. You've got your story now." The storage facility pulsed with activity under the night sky, its chain-link fence rattling as officers moved in and out. Paul stood near the warehouse entrance, the cool air brushing his face. Lila stayed close, her small hand brushing his sleeve, the star drawing safe in his pocket. Clara paced nearby, flipping through the Project Eclipse folder, her reporter's mind already chasing the next lead. Patrol cars lined the lot, their lights flashing across the crates of tech drones, drives and gear tied to Randall's smuggling ring. The scene was alive, but Paul's focus lingered on the loose ends. Randall sat cuffed in a patrol car, his head bowed, silent now after his earlier outburst. Elena stood a few yards away, flanked by two officers, her hands trembling as she answered their questions. Her sobs had stopped, replaced by a strained quiet. Paul watched her, then turned to Lila. "You did good," he said, his voice low. "Those notes saved more than you know." Lila looked up, her eyes bright despite the hour. "I wanted to help Clara," she said. "Mum wouldn't listen." Clara paused, joining them. "You saw me in the basement?" she asked, kneeling to Lila's level. Lila nodded. "Through a vent. I heard you talking about the boxes. Then they locked you up." Paul frowned, piecing it together. "You were in Harper Towers longer than I thought," he said to Lila. "How'd you get those notes to me?" She smiled faintly. I wrote them fast. Mum was busy with him. She nodded toward Randall's car. An officer approached, her clipboard heavy with notes. Social services is here, she said, gesturing to a woman stepping out of a sedan. We've got Alina's statement. She's claiming coercion, says Randall threatened Lila to keep her in line. Paul glanced at Elena, then back at the officer. Any proof? He asked. The officer nodded. Phone records, texts, enough to hold her for now. The kid's custody's the priority. The social worker, a tall woman with a calm demeanor, walked over, her badge gleaming under the lights. I'm Susan, she said, smiling at Lila. We're going to find a safe place for you tonight, okay? Lila hesitated, looking at Paul. He nodded reassuringly. Go with her. I'll check on you soon. Susan offered her hand and Lila took it, casting one last glance at Clara. Tell the truth, she said softly. Clara smiled. Always. As Susan led Lila to the sedan, Paul turned to the officer. What's next for Randall? He asked. Interrogation, she replied. He's clamming up, but the evidence? Crates, files, Alina's texts, ties him to illegal exports. Feds are on their way. Paul nodded, his mind shifting to Clara. She held the folder tight, her eyes scanning the lot. This isn't over, she said. The buyers, the network, it's bigger than one warehouse. Paul agreed, but exhaustion tugged at him. You've got enough for a start, he said. Let the police dig into it. Clara shook her head, her voice firm. I can't stop now. This story's my fight. She paused, then added, You're in it too, you know. That baton swing saved us. Paul chuckled, rubbing his neck. Just doing my job. But yeah, I'm in. The officer waved them over to a table where evidence was being catalogued. Crates lay open, their contents tagged. Circuit boards, encrypted devices, even a prototype drone with sleek wings. Clara snapped photos with her phone, her focus intense. This tech's cutting edge, she said. Private buyers may be overseas. Randall was the middleman. Paul picked up a drive, its surface cold, and Lila caught it all, he said. Smart kid. A commotion broke out near the patrol cars. Elena's voice rose, sharp and panicked. I didn't know he'd hurt anyone, she shouted as an officer guided her into a vehicle. He said it was just business. Paul watched, his jaw tight. She knew enough, he said to Clara. Coerced or not, she helped him, Clara nodded, her expression hard. She'll talk more at the station. Guilt's a good motivator. The feds arrived, their dark vans pulling into the lot. Agents in crisp jackets took over, barking orders as they secured the scene. One approached Paul and Clara, his badge flashing. Agent Torres, he said. We're taking Randall and the evidence. You two, statements now. Paul recounted the night. Lila's notes, the chase, the warehouse takedown. His voice steady despite the fatigue. Clara added her piece, handing over the folder. Project Eclipse, she said. Check the coordinates. There's more out there. Torres skimmed the files, his brow furrowing. This matches a case we've been tracking. Tech smuggling, high stakes. You've cracked it open. He nodded at Paul. Good work, Greg. We'll need you both for follow-ups. Paul shrugged. Just keep the kids safe. That's what matters. Torres assured him social services had Lila covered, then moved off to coordinate with his team. The night wore on, the lot emptying as evidence was loaded into vans. Clara sat on a crate scribbling notes, her energy unshaken. Paul leaned against the warehouse wall, the adrenaline fading. He pulled out Lila's final note, the star, and studied it. She's got a future, he said, half to himself. Clara looked up, smiling faintly. She does. And you, back to guarding doors? Paul shook his head, a spark igniting in his chest. Nah, this woke me up. Maybe I'll stick with you, chase the rest of this story. Clara raised an eyebrow, her tone teasing. Security guard turned investigator? I could use the muscle. He laughed, the sound rough but real. Deal. But I'm keeping the uniform. It's got history now. A social worker's car rolled out, Lila's small face visible in the window. She waved at Paul, her star drawing mirrored in the gesture. He waved back, the weight of the day lifting slightly. The feds hauled Randall away, his empire crumbling under the floodlights. Clara stood, tucking her phone away. First stop, my editor, she said. Then we find those buyers. Paul nodded, falling into step beside her. Let's move. The city stretched wide beyond the facility, its lights steady against the dark. Paul felt a shift, a purpose he hadn't known he'd lost. Lila's notes had pulled him into something bigger, and he wasn't turning back. The story wasn't over, but for now, they'd won.